be here now. Just be here now.
Is yoga and meditation really what people need? Or do people need a living wage? Or do people need a home, right? Or do people need healthcare?
Welcome to the Road Home podcast with Ethan Nichtern. Join Ethan as he and his guests explore the Buddhist path as it relates to art, culture, activism, politics, Western psychology, and more. If you'd like to support Ethan's podcast, please visit BeHereNowNetwork.com/Ethan.
So hi, everybody. Welcome back to the Road Home podcast. I'm Ethan Nichtern, and I'm joined by a returning guest, my friend, yoga teacher, activist, and now author, Kerri Kelly. New book, which is just out, super timely topic, American Detox, the myth of wellness and how we can truly heal. Kerri, welcome back to the Road Home podcast. First time as an author.
Oh God, that
Book
word.
author,
I don't even know what to say about that, but thank you. I'm so happy to be here.
Yeah. I just feel like we shouldn't run away from just accurate descriptions. That's not even a compliment. That's at this point, it's just, I'm
just getting used to it. I'm just trying it on, trying to get used to it. It's new for me, not so much for you. You're a many times author, but I'm a baby author.
Well, if you wrote a book, you have to call yourself an author. All right. 2022. How are you doing, first of all?
Oh gosh.
That's not usually how I start, but it's how I
My
should.
answer is almost always, I don't know. I think I'm just like waking up every day and trying to be ready for what's next, and doing the practice to like stay present and awake. And resourced, right, for the I don't know what's coming, right? And I feel like everything we see around us right now is revealing to us that there's stuff coming, and we have our plate full, and so that's sort of how I feel about things. I can't really see into the future. I feel like the last 5 years, and this because we've been working together in different capacities, has been just like a constant preparedness, like getting ready, using the practice to build a capacity to show up and be uncomfortable and lean all the way in and see clearly what's right in front of us. And so that's just sort of like been my constant for the last couple of years. And that's what I continue to do.
Yeah. Yeah. So I want to get into American Detox, your new book. So it's interesting because it starts with a very seminal moment for you on your path, which was the same seminal moment of when I really decided I wanted to try to teach meditation and Buddhism. Oh. So that was, but I already knew I wanted to practice it. But 9/11 was a huge moment in your past. So can you talk about sort of? I always ask people about their origin story, and that was so much about the start of your book. So talk to me about 9/11 and your path into yoga and wellness.
Yeah, it was definitely like the beginning of my journey, right? My spiritual journey, my journey I often describe of waking up. It was an enormous disruption in my life. For the first 25 years of my life, and I talk a little bit about this in the book, I spent sort of like on the should path. I grew up in a white suburban town outside of Manhattan. And so I had a really like clear predetermined path, as like an overachiever, and climb the ladder and be a perfectionist and be a good athlete and be a good Catholic and be a good student and be a good everything. And so I was very invested in that path. Quite frankly, I was like all in, and I was like fully, striving towards whatever that destination is, that kind of myth. That's part of like the myth, of the American dream when 9/11 happened. And for me, my stepdad was a fireman. He was based at Ladder 15, which was right around the corner from the World Trade Center. And he was the second house to respond. In fact, he saw the second plane hit him and his company when they were responding, and they rerouted the ladder to the second tower. And from what I know, they ran up 78 flights of stairs, and I'm sure saved countless lives.
Wow.
And perished when the second tower was the first to come down, right? So he went down with those towers, and with that, like everything I had learned about what was like real and safe and normal, about my life and about the world, right, came sort of crashing down with those towers. And so that was an enormous wake-up call for me, not just in like, losing someone dear to me, not just in like having to grieve the unimaginable. And for those of us who were in New York, it was just like such an intense, visceral moment, I think. But just in like the trajectory of my life and the meaning of my life and what I understood to be true, that moment sort of became an aperture that unlocked an entirety of questions, about, who I was and where I came from and what mattered. And that put me on this path of seeking meaning, this path of seeking truth, this path of like, what does it mean to heal and feel good again and feel whole again? And that's what led me to yoga and meditation.
Yeah. I mean, not to stay with 9/11, what a powerful, tragic, but beautiful story about your stepfather. I had gotten back to New York from living at a meditation center. It was a year after I graduated college for 6 months. And I think I got back like September 9th and was trying to figure out what I wanted to do, and was, staying at my mother's apartment, which then was on the Upper West Side. My dad lived, further downtown. And I just remember it being this big seminal moment. And it's been interesting to me living in the Trump era, because that, like the 2000 election and then 9/11 and then the aftermath, to me, I always mark, obviously the seminal moment could be of how we got to now as Americans, could be, 1619 or whatever you want to put it at. But like when people are like, oh, Trump's election really changed things, I was like, no, like Trump was just W with like a more intense, like, and I just remember that era being like, who is it leading us and where are they leading us to? And all the same features of like a media underreporting on how many people were protesting this. And so anyway, it's interesting to see, those folks of that era normalize when it was such a, for those of us who maybe were in our formative early adult moments then, so that was definitely the beginning of my, whatever I am as an activist. It wasn't Trump's election. It was that 9/11 era.
Yeah. I feel, and it's funny, like I'm 46 years old now. So like I can look back, right? And like you, I can identify many ruptures, right? In the fabric of our life, of our shared experience, that are invitations to wake the hell up. I don't know if I can curse on this podcast, but
you can.
Okay, thank you.
That's not even a curse. You can say shit on television.
I was going to say the F word, and then I'm learning to ask permission, and respect people's space. But yeah, like to wake the fuck up, and 9/11 was that for me. And there have been many more. I mean, the pandemic, was like an enormous, invitation to see things really clearly. And I think a lot of what I'm kind of grappling with in this book is our willingness to see, right? And because I think there's a lot of people who often wake up in those moments, and there are a lot of people who want to get back to so-called normal, right? And I remember that even after 9/11, I write about this, right? The first like cab horn I heard that kind of like shook me out of my stupor, where I was like, oh, like things are going back to normal. And I was really resisting that because we were still like deep in our grief. I think we were still in recovery. Like we were still looking for people. And so I just think that theme of like how quick we are, right? In this day and age, and in these particular modern bodies that we inhabit, to want to go back to the familiar, to want to go back to the illusion, the delusion, right, almost of security. And I remember that after 9/11. I remember that after when Trump got elected, how many people were like, oh shit. And then just like, just went like, this sucks, but let's just go back, to the way things are. And most certainly after a pandemic that killed 1 million people. Like we should never be the same.
Yeah. So what were your initial concerns as you had sort of waking up experiences in your yoga and wellness practice and the diligence of that practice for you, like, where did it start to feel like the way those teachings were being presented, or maybe not the instructions, but maybe it's more the worldview in which the teachings were presented was off?
Yeah. I mean, the contradiction I feel like in this book is that it's both like a fierce critique of wellness and also like, I, like many of us, are yearning to be well. And I discovered wellness in the wake of 9/11 when I was like desperately looking for a way to heal and to make sense of this like really cruel moment, right, in our shared history. And, meditation and yoga, I remember I was taking a yoga class actually across the street from the fire department, from the firehouse, one of the previous firehouse that my stepdad Joe worked at. And it was on my mat that I was able to feel, right? Like the rest of the time I was kind of just like coping and searching and seeking and raging and like, and distracting and numbing, but I'd hit my mat and I'd feel all the things. And I didn't even have words for it at the time, but I was like, there's something happening to me on the mat, right, that I want to know more about. So that's really what like pointed me in the direction of these spiritual practices. And I like went all in, right? Like I was like, oh my God, like this is where it's at for me. And I moved to San Francisco. Like I did like that whole like cliche thing. I like wore Lululemon pants. I wore mala beads, all the things. And I just want to admit that I found like real refuge on the mat. Like that was real for me also, right? I found real refuge, real meaning, a new sense of purpose and clarity that like was just like lost to me after 9/11. And bliss, right? Like I was just feeling like blissed out. Even like the culture, like everyone was having kind of this like church-like shared experience, right? When you share meditation, you share yoga, you share mantra and chanting, right? Like it can be like a viscerally, like it's an incredibly shared and collective experience. And so I was like hooked, like I was fully hooked, and all in, like really invested in this path. And the more I got into the practice and the more I centered, quite frankly, the practice in my life and in my everyday, and in who I wanted to become in the world, the more dissonance actually I started to feel about the world. And the way that that showed up for me quite literally is that I was taking yoga teacher training at a studio in the Soma, south of Market in San Francisco. And I would literally like walk out of my yoga studio all blissed out and sweaty and, looking ridiculous with my green juice. And there was like a community of homeless youth that was like literally like parked in the overpass that where the like entrance to the studio was. And so like immediately kind of coming out of this like blissed out, like enlightened, experience, I was like confronted, if you will, with a world that was very different, right? Outside my kind of my stupor, my wellness bubble. And I started to like feel conflict in my body and not know what to do with it. And that started to just kind of, in the same way that like 9/11 opened up questions for me, like that moment started to unlock all of these questions about like, well, wait a minute, like how can I have this blissed out experience when people are houseless, when people are like literally struggling to survive, much less be well. And so that was when I started to kind of pull the thread a little bit of wellness. Like, well, hold on a second, like how can, and why do I get to be well, right? When so many other people are suffering, which really started to force me to grapple with privilege and the privilege of being well, right? In a country that's set up that's set up for some of us to thrive and others not to. And so anyway, so that was that really like launched me into like a political analysis of wellness, and an inquiry into like, is yoga and meditation really what people need? Or do people need a living wage? Or do people need a home, right? Or do people need, healthcare? And so anyway, so that started me sort of on this more radical path of like democratizing wellness and also like disrupting the kind of wellness that reinforces those conditions of deep inequality and injustice.
So But it's interesting, right? Because like I got myself into because most of the people I teach and work with are more on the I don't think it's a spectrum, but have more of the values of a progressive person, right? So I actually got myself into trouble in one class because I had watched Gwyneth Paltrow's like Goop series on Netflix. And there's a lot of interesting methodologies there, right?
Yeah.
And it actually seemed like her staff was really invested, and like who wouldn't want to feel better in their bodies? And I'm a longtime yoga practitioner. I'm growing old, and have a child, so I have less time for it. So I feel even more like a dunce in my body than I did like 20 years ago.
Totally.
When I was starting. But if I do a asana practice even for 20 minutes, I always feel more grounded, more present, probably more likely to go out and actually pay attention to who is in the street, or who is in the people who are addicted to heroin at the BQE underpass, and
yes,
and try to actually interact and try to remember, like, oh, this is the totality of the world that's in my neighborhood. And so where does that dissonance actually happen? Because there's an interesting thing. It seemed like maybe it was it your yoga and meditation practice that allowed you to actually also see the homeless youth more?
I think 100%, right? Like, I think it was almost like my practice created the conditions for me for clear seeing, right? And for lifting the veil, right, of the the delusion, right, of my conditioning and my socialization, and the idea that wellness is a privilege, right, which we know is ridiculous. And so, yeah, I think in many ways, and often what I say to people is, if you're actually doing the practice, it becomes inevitable, actually, that you become confronted with these contradictions, right? And with seeing very clearly what's happening in the world, and you kind of can't go back, right? It's like it's really like an investment for like folks who are choosing not to see or neglecting. Like, you have to work really hard to not look at like the suffering that's everywhere right now. Like, you have to actually effort, I think, extremely to kind of create an alternate reality than actually what's happening and what's right in front of your face. And so, yeah, I do think that the practice gave me the capacity to like see and confront the truth of who we are and where we come from and what we're up against. But I also think it helped me lift the veil. And I was, after 9/11, I said, like, I want to know the truth. I want to know the truth of who we are. And sure enough, like, I got the truth, right? In all of its discomfort and in all of its horror, quite frankly. And it's funny because what you were saying about progressives, like, I too, felt like I was in a community of progressives, of people who shared values of equality and unity and compassion. And yet, as I started to really lean into some of these questions about what does it mean to be well in an unequal and toxic world, what I realized that, even a lot of our friends who claim to be progressive are very much invested in upholding the status quo and aren't really interested or committed to shaking the tree. And so that was some of the impetus behind writing this book. And it's also been sort of the impetus behind my own journey, which is like, how am I shaped, right? How am I conditioned and socialized to keep going with the flow? And what does it look like for me to disrupt that and choose to do something different?
Yeah. So, to position American Detox, like your book, in terms of what's going on now, it really seems like, well, part of this is like when I started teaching Buddhism and meditation, which was, 2001, 2002, it was crazy to think about making a living that way. And I had to, overcome ridiculous amounts of internal, shame of like, even, being able to value myself beyond just like, can I, scrape out a living and, eat some rice and beans. And I was privileged, so I didn't have debt. I had no money and no debt, which is a really good sweet spot of privilege, because you can, but good point. But you fast forward and yoga was already there where you could sort of make a living. It was valued enough, but you fast forward to the 20 teens, and there seems to be this accelerating, and maybe it's social media and the Instagram, like this influencer thing that happened, which what the hell is an influencer? And now it's a huge, these things are huge industries. So as it gets more profitable, is that part of the doubling down? Because it seems like you really have to double down on not seeing,
Yeah. And what's so funny to me, I mean, one of the charts I always see in my brain when I'm thinking about this book is that, the global wellness industry is a $4.3 trillion industry. I mean, like a massive, massive, massive industry with many tentacles reaching into reaching into politics and corporate life and all the things.
That's a lot of money.
And I imagine this like line on a chart, like just shooting up, to your point, given the trajectory of this industry, like tripling and doubling and quadrupling every year. And then when I think about the trajectory of inequality over the last 5 decades and how you could like map those things onto the same chart and see these, like while wellness soars, right? And people are so invested in wellness, so does inequality. And how do we reconcile that? Right? That is wellness in fact making us better, or is it making us, worse? And I don't know that I can explain the proliferation of wellness. I think there's many, many factors. I'm thinking specifically about like the book Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam and the dismantling of like civic structures, and also the fact that people have been sort of divesting from religious structures and becoming more secular for many years. And also just the state of the world, the state of like medical care, right? And how that's been also disintegrating over time. And so like, there's a part of me that's like, it's no wonder people are seeking, right? Like I was one of those people. It's no wonder people are reaching for like relief and meaning, and clarity about like how to be alive in this moment. And yet so much of actually what we're being sold is bullshit. It's not like the real deal. And I think you're right. Like these practices for me have transformed me. They've changed my life. I would say they saved me after 9/11 in many, many ways, and continue to. And I know that they mean that for so many people. And I think what I'm inviting in this book is like discernment about like, what are these practices? In fact, where do they come from? Whose cultures and lineages do they come from? And what has happened to them? What has capitalism and colonization and white supremacy done to distort this medicine, right? These rituals, these practices, and literally divorce them from their origins. And so yeah, I'm not trying to reject wellness with this book. There's a part of me that's like really trying to like be a part of like what it means to restore it, and what it means to also like lean into the question of like, what does it mean to be well? What does it mean to appreciate these practices? What does it mean to do the repair that's probably called for, given what we in Western culture and in dominant culture have actually done to what is ancient medicine?
So it definitely feels like we're in this moment where there's almost like what I would call, and I mean this actually as a compliment, but a kind of very adolescent phase of people starting to see what's wrong, and the adolescent phase of rebellion is like, this is fucked up, right? The world is fucked up. And
something's wrong.
Something's wrong, right? So in that phase, you lash out a lot. You tell people they're doing it wrong. You tell people you're not going to do it that way. And it's a very like, at least and then there's social media, that the structure of which just kind of makes people really want to call people out. And, you don't do that in this book. You could. I mean, this book could be one, in a sense, it's calling all of us out, which is something I really like about your approach, right? You're calling out
myself included.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. Which means you're not a narcissist, right? Which is great. And I already knew that about you. But like, so what is the function? Because you do have, there's also kind of, there's niches in the world right now that are like, I'm going to call out the wrongdoing in the world, right? And then it becomes a like they said, or people get very defensive, and there's like a niche for the call out. And so, like, how useful is keeping it there? Like, here are the people doing things wrong. I mean, do we need do we need publicly airing out the examples of wellness individuals who are maybe acting manipulatively or are being profit oriented or overly profit? I mean, what we call profit, some people call what they would call profit, I would just call actually making a living, which is not actually a capitalist enterprise. So talk to me about like call out culture and where you see that in the sort of backlash to this kind of wellness industry.
Yeah. Well, what I'll share is that you're right. Like, I was very careful in this book to not like focus the rage on particular individuals, but rather on the system and the culture. Like, my inquiry is about is really about like this toxic culture that we're steeped in, both within, the wellness culture, but also within America, right? Like, wellness isn't that unique, and that, it's just like one microcosm of like the larger problem. And so that was sort of my grappling in this book. And I feel like what you're speaking to is accountability, right? I feel like we call it cancel and we call it call out culture, and some of that is happening, right? But really, I think what folks are responding to is a need for accountability. And the challenge about like desiring and requiring that need is that we have a really unhealthy relationship with accountability in this culture, right? We're oriented and indoctrinated in a culture of punitive accountability where we punish people and we incarcerate them and we police them and control them. And so I just want to say that as context, because I think often what's happening is that we're either doing that to people or we're actually not holding people accountable, right? And we're seeing that right now, especially related to politicians, like in not holding people in Congress accountable, not holding our former president accountable. And there are lots of like really powerful people who have gotten away with literally murder, right? So I just want to like name that as context, because when I think about the Me Too movement, when I think about the ways in which there have been some very necessary call outs, it's because there hasn't been an existing system or condition of accountability, right? And I've seen some really cool examples of the ways in which folks have organized, right, to hold people accountable. And sometimes that happens on social media, which can feel really shitty, right? And I think sometimes that's necessary in the absence of systems that hold people accountable. I think to organize and to use the tools and the technology that we have to hold people accountable so that we can disrupt the pattern of harm is really, really important. And so I want to name that, right? And I also think that there's, the pendulum swings often because of the ways in which we have internalized carceral logic. There's a way in which, and also because I think, people sometimes get famous for calling people out. You get attention, you get likes, you get, validation, you feel seen and
you
heard.
Get very popular podcasts.
You get a super
only calling people out.
Totally. Right. So like that's happening too, right? Though these two things are happening at the same time. And to me, it's like, being in a critical practice of discernment is really important when we're thinking about what accountability is needed, what tools do we have to hold people accountable, and how do we organize around that? And, some people are just sort of like knee-jerk reacting and using their platforms and using social media and using the popularity and the kind of, I feel like there's like adrenaline and like addiction quality to like calling people out. Like it's like, and I think it's really needed sometimes. So anyway, so I don't have like a straight answer for you because I don't think it's a binary, but I do think we have an accountability problem. At the end of the day, like I feel like the call out and cancel culture is a symptom of an accountability problem. And I think we can put more attention and energy into how do we create a culture and a practice of accountability that holds people in their humanity and doesn't in fact replicate systems of harm and incarceration and punitive politics.
Yeah. So I think just to be clear, I intentionally did not use the term cancel culture because that's a right-wing talking point.
Yes.
And
thank you for that.
and you know, until somebody demonstrates to me the powerful person who is now homeless, you know, who has been called out, you know,
that part,
you know, that everybody's fine. You may have lost a job,
fine.
You may have lost some followers, etc.
That's absolutely right.
And also what I found is like, you know, it's really possible to be in situations of mutual consent with the people that you work with, so that that creates situations where if you get called out for something, it's either a conversation or the person just said, yeah, I don't want to work with you anymore, you know. And that's what, you know, maybe it's because I am a person of privilege, you know, maybe it's because, I mean, I'm just thinking about this because this is happening during the mutual defamation suit of Johnny Depp and Amber Heard.
Right.
And that's just taking up, it just looks like a spectacle, you know, it almost looks like gladiator sport, the new reality TV. And there's sort of
that we're all watching.
Yeah. And it's like, this cannot be the way to resolve accountability. And
it's really sad, actually.
Yeah, it's really sad. And you just, you know, I was reading what their therapist said, and said, you know, their couples therapist said, I saw mutual abuse in this relationship. It's like, that looking at these two people, I'm like, that would be what I would guess as a person who studies the human mind. But it's just sucking all the oxygen out of the room, you know, or, you know, then there's the Will Smith thing, you know, it's just like, we really like to be spectators to reality television, rather than what do we empower, you know? And that's always where my mind goes, is like, you know, because I have a 5-year-old daughter. Like, so when you look at me too, like, how do I help this person learn? Like, here's how to claim your power, and here's how to participate in things. And if they don't feel right, get out, you know, and know that you can. That's where I want to see the future headed. And you do, like, you see that like with Amazon's labor victory or things like this, where people are just like, oh shit, we have power. Let's use it. Let's not spend all of our energy litigating the past, although you do really have to acknowledge. And I think that's, from a Buddhist standpoint, that's the most important part about the call out or the accountability, is like acknowledging so that healing can begin.
Yeah. Well, and, you know, my mentor, Taj James, says, you know, we build a future by repairing the past. And so some of it is also like understanding the relationship between the two, that like repair needs to happen so that we can unlock a different future, or a new pattern, or a new path forward. And the other thing that's coming up for me in what you're saying too, is that I really appreciate what you're saying about like spectator sport, and also like how much of a bypass it is to be like, that's happening over there, you know, that those messed up relationships and those really toxic dynamics. And I feel like often, you know, what's happening out there is happening in our micro relationships. And I think we could all benefit from being like, how are these dynamics playing out in my relationships? In fact, right? Because that's how I understand the power of culture, right? It's like the air that we breathe. We're all internalizing, you know, these really toxic beliefs and behaviors. And if we're not paying attention, we're often acting them out with each other. And I've done this bajillions of different ways and continue to do it, right? In ways that I still can't see. 46 years of like breathing the same shitty air. And so that's a question I bring into all my relationships now, is like, actually, how am I replicating this in my relationships, right? What is my propensity to control or to need to be right or righteous, you know, in relationship, and how am I not listening, right? And being compassionate and empathetic. So anyway, so I just named that too, because I think we're quick, especially those of us who are activists, are quick to be like, you know, to rage against the thing over there and actually have really messed up relationships at home, you know, and I've had
Karl Marx was the first example of that. Actually.
Exactly. Right. So I've had to like,
the Buddha was a bad example of that too, to be honest.
Everyone, right? Like it's so much easier to look and critique and also like to like play in the meta space. And, you know, so it's been really raw for me and confronting to be like, how is this actually playing out for me in my closest relationships? And what does it look like for me to really be in, you know, political practice inside of my intimate relationships in the way that I want us to be in political practice out in the world.
Yeah. Yeah. So I guess moving towards, so right. This is the trick of America, is that there's at least 2 layers, probably 3 layers if you add in patriarchy, but you have the most brutal system of slavery the world has ever seen, right? You have indigenous genocide, and then you have the replication of systems of patriarchy. You have those 3 layers, right, going on, and none of them have been really acknowledged, right, fully, like as sort of that level of repair, which is literally what the word reparations means. So,
yeah.
So, right, we do have to do a lot more work in the acknowledgement, right?
Yeah. And I mean, just to make it even messier, like these systems are all in collusion with one another, right? So it's like, they're not even like separate things to be acknowledged in isolation, right? They're deeply interwoven and intertwined with one another, which makes it really hard. Like, it's hard to tease out, you know what I mean? It's like, there's so much scar tissue, if you will, around these systems, and they're so entrenched in our structures and in our institutions and in our bodies, right? That it's, I don't mean that to like, you know, I don't mean that to sound like despairing, but like that shit's real deep, right? And so like, I'm like, so as you're naming that, I'm just thinking like, yeah, what does acknowledgement look like? But you know, and what does it look like to unpack, right? To like understand the impact and implications of these systems and the ways in which they collude, and how can we start to see more clearly the intersections between all of these different ideologies and systems that have kind of like colluded to create this really, you know, unique situation that we're in right now.
Yeah. Yeah. So my internal logic is sort of like looking at the lash out or the call out as this sort of like adolescent phase. And then the hope is that and then you have a group of people who are in the kind of toddler phase, really, of like, we're just going to follow these narcissists. And that is the allure
like
of
give
that,
your
right?
power over. Well, and the guru, right? I'm just thinking about that even in the context of wellness has been around forever, right? And so like the ways in which we have worshipped and given our power over to the guru, and we've seen many gurus fall, right? From the pedestal,
I have no idea what
fall
you're talking
from
about.
Grace. Right. But so it's like, so I think there's also inquiry around, you know, like, how do we be in relationship with spiritual leadership and spiritual authority? And then how do we find, you know, how do we cultivate spiritual authority within ourselves? And how do we be reverent? I mean, I just think there's like lots of juicy inquiry around that. And then how are our spiritual practices, you know, absorbing the really toxic hierarchies and, you know, the narcissistic tendencies of like power over and control that they're designed to actually confront. And being critical, I think, is a first step. And I mean that in like a compassionate way, like actual critique.
But yeah, I guess what I'm wondering is like, then what's the next? Like, so if we took the example of like a yoga class, right? What would that look like to you? Or what does that look like as you're coming out of this individualistic, you know, Lululemon, you know, and malas? I'm surprised Lululemon never made its own malas. I don't think they did, but
they made everything else. So.
They made everything else. Like, you're moving in a different direction. Like, are there examples for you? I've had a few, you know, yoga teachers who are trying to move in this direction, like Jacoby Ballard on the podcast, but like, we didn't really get into it. So like, not just what are the practices, but what does the space look like? What practice is it? Is it the same yoga class with a different view being taught? Or
I mean, of course, like influencers and teachers, people with more proximity to power in wellness and influence, have a responsibility. I'm even just thinking though about practitioners and the ways in which practitioners can begin by seeing their class in a different way and being like, who's not here? Right? Who's missing, and who is this class for? And do the conditions exist within this space for everyone to walk through the door? And for practitioners and consumers of these products to start to ask really hard questions of the owners, of the, you know, teachers, of the managers of these spaces. I think that's a beginning also, right? Like the reckoning that teachers go through, I think is something that really matters. And I think to your point, we're seeing that happen in different areas. And we're seeing that not happen with a lot of teachers also. But like, to me, as an organizer, right, the power is in the congregation, and it's in the people actually starting to be like, what the fuck, y'all? and questioning the cost or the price of entry, questioning whether studios are accessible and they are designed for all bodies, right? Questioning who's at the front of the class and what kind of body do they have, and do people in the class feel like their body is represented, right, in the leadership or in the teacher. So part of me, that's sort of like, I feel like there's a lot of juice there, right? You mentioned like that, Amazon, union, like as an organizer, I'm like, the congregation needs to rise up if we want the choir to shift, and therefore, the ministers and the priests of the church. And so anyway, so that I think is part of it, right? Is like everyone starting to be like, wait a minute, something's not right here. And also I think folks, wellness practitioners starting to reckon with the fact that like they may have access to a yoga class or to a great yoga teacher or to healthy food or to whatever, microfiber yoga pant, like whatever the thing is that symbolizes the idea, the myth that you might be well. But I think when folks start to realize that they're actually not well, that we're actually like, that our well-being is really limited by the structures and the conditions that we're a part of, and that often we're participating in, then I think people also are going to realize that they have skin in the game. And they have a stake, right? When we realize that our well-being and our liberation are bound, right? We realize that like we're part of this fight too, even if we benefit from it, right? Even if we're more proximal, right, to the benefits and the privileges, right, of the system or the industry of wellness. And so anyway, so that's part of like what I'm thinking about. And then, to your point, like influencers, people with power, company owners, studio owners, starting to do different things, maybe getting out of the way, right? Like, I think, the last chapter of this book is called Reimagining Wellness. And when I was thinking about what to offer around that, I was like, nobody wants one more like white, skinny, able-bodied wellness teacher, yoga teacher to tell them what it means to be well. And so I actually interviewed a bunch of people who were doing really radical wellness practice on the front lines of different movements. And I was like, well, what does wellness look like to you, right? What is the future of wellness? And I let them lead the conversation, and I kind of stepped back. So that's sort of like, given my social location, I feel like that's like my assignment with this book, is to like disrupt, it's to question everything. It's to like make a mess and make trouble of the spaces and the systems that I'm more proximal to. And then to look to people who have been often excluded and marginalized by wellness, who have been doing wellness subversively for many, many decades, and to let them lead sort of the next expression or the iteration of wellness that includes everyone. Yeah.
So I want to talk about stepping back, because it's a great aspiration. And I do agree that the to me, like, causes and conditions are very interdependent, but the number one kind of cause of how a class or a retreat or whatever it is goes is who's leading, right? I think that's sort of, and so you do need to question like who's leading, who are in the teacher position,
who has control, who's making decisions.
But is that because every time I try to step back, somebody's like, so what are you doing, Ethan? There's a like, it's the request is sort of, it's hard to actually understand what the request is sometimes of people like who does need another white male, teacher. But also then the other part of me is like, well, this is a very new profession and very few people actually bridge East and West, and for a person under 45 years of age, it's a little bit of like in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man person is king. I'm like, oh shit, I do actually have more experience than, most people doing this. And people are keeping asking me to do it. And so is it about stepping? Because I think sometimes people are like, oh, nobody wants to hear what I have to say. Or is it really more about amplifying? Because anytime people say step back, there's somebody else saying step forward. And that's, I get confused by that. I mean, you haven't stopped teaching. You wrote a book, and so.
Yeah, I actually don't think I don't think there's a simple answer to what you're saying. And I also think that the clarity is often found in relationship, right? So like it's inside of my relationships that I can locate myself and discern like, when is it appropriate for me to in fact step up because I have a responsibility that I need to actually own? And when is it more appropriate for me to get out of the way?
Yeah.
Right. Because of what I don't know, I don't know. Right. And I just think of like, I too, like have I have tons of experience and training and, so much of that has been has been a privilege. And also like, there's a lot I can't possibly understand given the body that I'm living in, which does a disservice to many of the people that I'm teaching. And so, right. So I'm like, so I think that level of discernment, so it's not as simple as like, stop doing everything and get out of the way and give up all your money. Like, I don't think that's helpful. I think deeper levels of discernment, and also like when you don't know, like, what is the move here? Do I step forward or do I step back? If you have relationships of accountability, they will tell you this is a space where you need to step back. And then all right, cool. And, or this is a space where I need you to step forward because it's unsafe for me. And then it's my responsibility to step forward, right? Because I have less to risk. So anyway, so I just think it's a dance, quite frankly. And I know people are like, the most like frequent question I get, and I'm sure you get this too, is like, just tell me what to do, Kerri, like, tell me how to be a good ally or how to, and I'm like, there is no good ally. Like that's, that in and of itself is a myth. And the way to know or to most skillfully show up is to show up in relationship and like accountable and mutual relationships across lines of difference, to have people in your life that are going to hold you accountable, and they will help you discern and choose, right, the best way to respond in each situation, because it's never it's never, cookie cutter or prescribed or binary or fixed. It's always dynamic, and to your point, like nobody's a monolith, right? So like different people will demand different things of you. And so you're just going to have to be like so centered in your relationships of accountability and in your practice that you're prepared to be wrong. Like I've made many mistakes, right? Or be prepared to like hold that, like people are going to be in conflict about this, about like, what is the right role of white people or white people in wellness or what, whatever the inquiry is, not everybody agrees. And to assume that they do is to assume people are a monolith. And that's also ridiculous. And so anyway, so to me, I just keep defaulting to relationship. Like, who are my relationships of accountability? Who can I trust to tell me the truth? A question for people is like, do I even have relationships of accountability? And if I don't, like, what is the process of building trust and building bridges so that people can reflect back to me and mirror back to me what I probably can't see myself.
Right. And then you have to like see how it lands, right? You have to take that feedback, because we also seem to be in this era where, there's a certain level of word policing, which I think there's a backlash against that. And there's also a certain level, I saw a comedian speaking to this, of sort of getting offended on behalf of a whole group that you're not even part of. That seems to be something that white people do, is say like, that's offensive to this group and you're not, but you're like, wait a minute, you're not a representative of that group. And then
right. Have you been asked to say that, right? Yeah. Have you been given permission to, yeah.
So it's
messy stuff.
It's a real messy. Yeah. And I think and there is this promise on the other side of a like kind of clean. I think some of this backlash against a lot of this is like, don't do any of that. Don't get messy at all. These people are just completely there to fight with each other. And why do that?
Which is, equally in collusion, right? Like being silent, not acting, ducking from any kind of conflict or interaction is being as complicit as actually like making a mistake or actively colluding. And so anyway, so like that too isn't really helpful. And I feel like what you're talking about, I feel like is inviting people to have a power analysis, right? And one of the tools that has been most helpful for me is social location. It's like locating myself, not just in my purpose and in my presence, which we often like cue people in a lot of wellness spaces, but like locating myself in like social systems, right? Yeah. And in systems of power, and given all of the many social group memberships and identities that I embody. Like, what is my proximity to power and privilege in every relationship, in every space, and every action I'm a part of? And what does that mean about, how I can skillfully participate and respond in relationship to the whole of who we are? And so that's been really helpful for me, because it means that my location is never the same. It's always contextual, which to your point means that I need to be discerning about, like, when is it appropriate for me to step forward and when is it appropriate for me to step back? And I also do think that, like, we, and I'm sure you're doing this too, like, I'm making really critical decisions about, like, when and how to teach movement, and I'm also, like, in constant grappling with it. Like, I'm not decided about whether or not and how I should teach yoga and meditation. And, so, and to your point, like, lots of people disagree about, like, what I should do with that and what my role is. And so it's not clear to myself or to anyone. And I like live into the question every day, and I really hold that question in this book. And I don't know what to tell people about. People ask me that, like, well, what should I do? And I'm like, I don't know. Get in relationship with people for whom those practices are a part of their lineage and a part of their ancestral medicine, and be in relationship and ask.
All right. Well, I think this is a good place to pause our conversation for now. But Kerri Kelly, your new book, I'm going to encourage people to read it. American Detox, The Myth of Wellness and How We Can Truly Heal, is out right now as of when this podcast is released. So good summer reading for questioning.
Good, fierce, confrontational, soul digging reading for you. Read
this book and then stare at your yoga mat and your meditation cushion real hard and think about what those things serve and what they mean. Which is a good thing for all of us to do.
I think so.
Kerri, thanks so much for being on the Road Home podcast, and please come back soon.
Super grateful, Ethan. And thank you for the ways in which I love your voice on Twitter, and I'm following you in all the ways. And so keep it up, keep talking.
All right. Well, for the Road Home podcast, this is Ethan Nichtern, and we'll see you all next time.